Hello, Cameron and Jacob and William and Ariana and James. Today it's Opa's turn to tell you a story. It's a story that I told to your daddies many years ago when they were little, just like you. It's a story about a bear, a skunk, and a porcupine. So let's get started.
Once upon a time, there was a great big brown bear. Hello! He was so big that just for fun, all his forest friends just called him Tiny. Now, Tiny was always happy and he was friendly to the other creatures in the forest. All of the forest creatures loved him. Each day, Tiny ate a lot, and his favorite food was ants and grubs. He would often turn over large rocks and logs to find the bugs that lived underneath. Yum, yum. He would happily lick them up and chew them, crunch, 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 until his great big bare stomach couldn't hold even one more ant or beetle. Now one day Tiny woke up especially hungry. Instead of his usual routine, which was sitting in his big bare chair, drinking coffee and watching the news, he immediately went outside his den and set out on a search for food. Now, most days he would take time to stop and chat with the other animals of the forest, but not today. Today he was in a hurry. He was very hungry. Soon he spotted a large log lying on its side. He just knew that under it would be plenty of juicy bugs to eat. So he pushed and he pulled, trying to roll the log away. He desperately wanted to get to those bugs. Finally, using all his big muscles, Tiny succeeded in rolling the log away, and just as he had expected, there he saw a veritable feast of ants, beetles, and grubs. His tummy rumbled and his mouth began to water. He leaned down close to the bugs and said to them, "Good morning, little bugs. You look delicious, and you are about to be my breakfast. Ha 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 ha." The bugs were terrified and began running in all directions. Oh my! But just as Tiny was about to take his first bite, a small voice behind him called out, "I'll take those beetles, thank you." Tiny had never heard this voice before, so he glanced around to see who had spoken. To his surprise, he found that it was a small black and white creature about the size of a cat. It was a skunk. The skunk repeated, "I'll take those beetles, thank you." Tiny chuckled to himself. "Who does this little skunk think he's talking to?" And Tiny replied, "After I've eaten my fill, you are welcome to any bugs that remain, but you certainly will not be the first one to eat. And what is your name anyway?" The skunk replied, "My name is Mr. Stinky, and I always get my way." Tiny replied, "Sorry, pal. Looks like today's not your day, because I'm going to eat first, and there is nothing you can do about it." Stinky replied, "I think you will change your mind." Now Tiny was growing annoyed at the interruption of his breakfast, and he replied angrily, "Why should I change my mind? Look how big I am, and look how small you are. You're not big enough to scare me away. I could crush you with one paw." To this, Stinky replied, "Mr. Bear, it's obvious that you don't know much about skunks. Skunks have a secret weapon. It's a special spray that is so stinky that it will make you run away. I don't need to be big or strong. I can scare you away without even coming near you." The bear said, I don't believe you. Now run away home before you get hurt." In reply, Stinky turned and gave a small squirt of his special spray. Psst, psst. The air filled with a green mist that was so incredibly smelly that none of the forest creatures could stand it. "What on earth is that smell?" said the deer. "Hold your breath," said the cat. "I can't stand it," said the rabbit. "Outrageous!" cried the squirrel, and he fell over unconscious. "Oh, that's awful," said the monkey, and he tried to put his fingers in his nose. "Whoo, that's a bad one," said the owl. Tiny tried to remain with the bugs, but he just couldn't stand the stink. But he was very angry. He moved away, far away from the stink, and he cried out to Stinky, "This is just not fair. I did all the work and you have done nothing. You are stealing my breakfast." Stinky didn't care, and he didn't mind his own smell. He ambled forward and was soon enjoying a wonderful meal that Tiny had found. "Arr," said Tiny as he shuffled away in search of another breakfast. But soon Tiny found another log that looked promising. It was not as good as the previous log, but he was starving and immediately set about rolling over the log to expose the bugs that lived underneath. Lots of bugs and beetles. This is going to be good. Tiny didn't waste any time this time. He immediately bent down to have his first bite, when suddenly, what do you think he heard from behind him? He heard, "I'll take those beetles, thank you." Tiny whirled around to find the skunk standing with his tail already raised, ready to spray his stinky skunk smell. Suddenly, all the animals were afraid that the skunk would spray again. The lemur froze from fright. The squirrel yelled, "Stop!" and he put on his gas mask. The mouse ran away. Even the pigs were afraid, and the cat was in shock. Tiny was furious, but there was nothing he could do. He turned and walked away, leaving Stinky to eat his second breakfast. As he shuffled away, he shouted, "This is so unfair!" Now, as Tiny went away angrily on his way to find his third breakfast, a small squirrel joined him on his way. And the squirrel said, "Hey, Tiny, I think I have an idea that might just save you from losing your next breakfast to that skunk." The squirrel came closer to Tiny and whispered something in his ear. Psst, 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 psst. Slowly, Tiny began to smile. Then he chuckled. Then he laughed out loud. "Ha ha, this is going to be good. Come on, little buddy, let's go." So off they went together, chatting and both chuckling as they went about putting their new plan together. In time, Tiny found another promising-looking log. He pulled and he pushed until he finally managed to roll it away. "Yes," he cried out loud. "Look at all those bugs." Without looking around, Tiny immediately bent down to eat the bugs. But just then he heard these dreaded words, "I'll take those beetles, thank you." Without even looking, Tiny knew that Stinky would be standing there with his tail already raised in the air. This time, Tiny didn't protest or get angry. He just walked away to let the skunk move forward to eat the bugs. But just as Stinky was about to take his first bite, he heard a voice behind him say,
"Well, howdy, partner. I'll take those beetles, thank you."
"What?" Stinky whirled around to confront anyone who would dare to interrupt his breakfast. And much to his surprise, he came face to face with a very strange creature covered in little sharp spines. Stinky said, "Who are you, and what do you think you're doing?" The new creature said,
Well, I'm a porcupine, but my friends just call me Mr. Pins. I'm here to eat all those tasty bugs you have there. Now, please step aside. You're standing between me and my breakfast.
Stinky was angry. He said, "I'm not letting you eat my breakfast. Don't you know I'm a skunk, and I can spray you with my stinky skunk spray?"
Mr. Pins replied, Well, I'm a porcupine, and I can stick you full of my sharp quills. They'll hurt a lot and will stick in your skin for days.
Stinky said, "Don't you care about my stinky skunk spray?"
Not really. You see, I have a terrible head cold, and I can't smell anything. Go ahead, give it your best shot.
Stinky was very angry, but he knew he could not possibly win against this battle. He shuffled away, grumbling to himself. When he was safely out of range of the porcupine's prickly quills, he turned and shouted at Mr. Pins, "This is not fair! You did nothing to earn these bugs. You just showed up and stole them from me." Mr. Pins replied,
Isn't that what you just did to the bear? You just showed up and stole his breakfast from him. Twice.
Stinky had to admit that was exactly what he had done to the bear. He had stolen the bear's breakfast twice this morning. Stinky was very sorry for his actions. He hung his head, turned to Tiny and said, "Oh, Mr. Bear, I'm so sorry. I have been selfish and uncaring. I'm so sorry I stole your breakfast. Can you find it in your great big heart to forgive me?" Tiny put on his most grumpy face and said, "You have been a very bad skunk. You've stolen my breakfast twice today." Then Tiny smiled and said, "Of course I forgive you. You have obviously learned a good lesson today, that you shouldn't steal. And I've learned a good lesson too, that it's good to share with your friends. Now let's go and join Mr. Pins and share that great meal of bugs." "What?" cried Stinky. He turned and found that Mr. Pins and all the forest creatures were smiling at him. "Oh, now I get it. This was all just a plan to show me the failings of my ways. You guys were too smart for me." All of the animals watched Stinky for his reactions. They were worried that Stinky would become angry and fill the air with his skunk smell. The raccoon held his breath. The meerkats watched with anticipation. The owl stopped hooting and stared, and the squirrel stopped climbing the flower stem. Stinky was frowning, thinking about what had just happened to him. But slowly he began to smile, and then he began to laugh, and soon all the forest creatures were laughing right along with him. The donkey laughed, the orangutan laughed, the seal laughed, the frog laughed, the owl hooted his laughter, and the raccoon cheered, "Hooray!" Then everyone gathered together to enjoy the feast of bugs. They were all friends, and they were all sharing, and they were all happy. And so it came about that Tiny, Stinky, Mr. Pins, and the little squirrel became the very best of friends, and they shared their breakfast with each other every day. All the forest creatures were glad, and they lived happily ever after. The end.
And that's the end of our story. And the lesson of this story is that we are blessed to have anything to share, and that it is enjoyable to share our blessings. It's the right thing to do. Bye. Opa loves you.
Dogs out. Let the dogs out. Say get up and dance to the music. Come on, everybody now. Dance to the music. Oh yeah. Dance to the music. Dance to the music. Smack, you ain't dancing yet. Dance to the music. Oh yeah. Dance to the music. That's how I like it. Dance to the music. Everybody. Dance to the music. Somebody. Dance to the music. Somebody. Hey, Pinocchio, you want to watch that nose, man?